really delighted to be with all of you here this morning. I want to take this first occasion of being with you, however, to express once again to Father Mike and his mother and sister who are here with us our condolences at the loss of his father. And we've all been through an experience of losing a parent or maybe a spouse, and know the heartache that's there. And so we just want to let you know of our support for you at this time. These 50 days that we have just experienced for the Easter season have been designed to help us understand that question that was in the hearts of the disciples as they went down the mountain after the transfiguration. And Jesus talked about the resurrection of the dead. What does the resurrection of the dead mean? And not just in terms of a concept, but what does it mean for us? Not just a matter of understanding it, but standing under it and allowing it to have an impact on our lives. How are our lives any different at this particular moment because of Jesus rising from the dead? And not just that it would be, our lives would be changed when we die and that we will rise, but now, here and now, what difference does it make? And it's very clear that as the disciples struggled with that question, what came to their understanding is that the resurrection was more than just about Jesus. In fact, I think that if I were scripting how the resurrection would have gone, I may have done it differently. I would have liked to have Herod show up, Jesus show up at Herod's house or Pilate's porch and made it the biggest I told you so. But that was just maybe a bit too much Hollywood for Jesus. But what we see in these 50 days is that the resurrection not only brings Jesus back from the dead, but gives new life to those who are disciples, changes them. They too are raised, and we have said that time and again in the prayers that we have prayed in these 50 days. We too are risen. But then again, where do we experience that resurrection, that new life? Where do we detect that Spirit of the risen Lord that is given fully on the Feast of Pentecost today, working in us? How do we detect that presence of God's Spirit working in us? We're given some hints today. The first is by the very impulse that we have to unify with one another. The ancient temptation that lurks in the hearts of all of us as human beings, as part of original sin, going back to that scene in the garden, is the temptation to live by ourselves, to isolate ourselves. Eve, by herself, takes the apple, the fruit of the tree. And then when they both do so, they go in isolation and hide from God. We all know ourselves that there is a narrative out there, a story in the world that says that real freedom means being unencumbered by the claims of other people. Not allowing yourself to be so entangled with others that they're going to make demands on you. But the Spirit of the risen Lord tells us that our lives are better when we do have bonds with one another. And so, if you find yourself sitting with a sick child or a sick parent, going to a funeral and just being present to those who are mourning, if there is an inspiration to do public service, whether that's in society or in the church, or as you are married, and maybe learning those first steps of how that new life together is not a threat to yourself, but by giving yourself to each other, and by bringing children into the world and sharing your life as a couple. That's the work, that's the presence, the activity of the Spirit in your life. Some years ago, I did a wedding for a young couple that I vacationed with their family with often. And after they got married, we were on a lake, and he was out there looking at his father's catamaran, his sailboat, and he said, next year I want to get one of those. So next year rolls around. And so Greg is there. There's no catamaran out on the lake, but he's holding in his arms his young son. And I said to him, Greg, you didn't get that catamaran. But as he looked down at his son, he said, yeah, but what a great trade-off. He experienced the power of the risen life. The power that gave him the urge to go out of himself, to share his life with his wife, with the new family. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. Whenever we're drawn back into ourselves in isolation, that's the work of evil in our life. It's an evil also that can inflict our communities, our society, where we want to go back into our own ethnic groups or language groups, where we want to in some way talk about us and them. What the Holy Father is encouraging us all to do in this time of renewal of the church is to see that when we build bonds of unity with each other and take the risk, it is the very work of Christ's Spirit that's working there. And so today, look for ways in which you are drawn to unity in your family, your workplace, your parish, your neighborhood. That's the work of the Spirit. That's the work of the risen Lord that's given to you today. But we also see that the work of the Spirit changes the way we use language. That's a big factor today in this Feast of Pentecost that the disciples experienced. They spoke in different languages but understood each other. And sometimes we use language that's so very harsh and divisive, especially if we get into our mind that every problem in life is a nail, and so therefore the only solution is a hammer. The Lord today asks us, how do we use language? Especially in moments of controversy. Can we use language to unite? Maybe to step back if we don't have the right words and keep our mouth shut until we find them. A father one day was approached by his 16-year-old daughter. She said to him, Dad, I go to Mass every Sunday with the family, and it's the same old thing, and I don't get anything out of it, so I don't want to go anymore. Now, I know that's shocking to you parents who've never heard that. And of course, the father might have gotten upset with that and said, no, you're in the family, and you're going to Mass. That's all there is to it. But instead he said, I get that. I understand. It's hard to do things when it's the same thing and monotonous and you don't get anything out of it. He said, for instance, the last 4 years, I've been getting up 3 times a week at 4:30 in the morning to take you to swim practice. And I go in swim practice and I watch you go back and forth. Back. It's the same thing. And I don't get anything out of it. But when I see what it does for you, and especially when you compete, it's enough for me. That's what I get out of it. I get out of it seeing how your life has changed, and better because of it. And so when you go to Mass, maybe look around to the people that you're there with and how they need a youthful face. The encouragement of someone who's going to continue the faith that is so dear to them because you're there. Think of maybe what you're giving rather than what you're getting. His words seem to me to be very Spirit-filled, because he looked for a way to use words to move forward in a discussion rather than to close it off. He also spoke in a way that let her see the bigger picture of life. So often, when we have disputes, we forget that there is a bigger picture, and our words can cause collateral damage and hurt and pain. The work of the Spirit is being able to use words that heal. Isn't that what Jesus did when he rose from the dead? His first words were, "Peace be with you." Can those be our first words? In moments of fear and disappointment, the disciples had in their hearts, "Peace be with you." Finally, we understand, or we experience, the resurrection, the power of the Spirit working in our midst in a way that brings healing. There were hearts that were troubled in those disciples, and Jesus says, "Forgive each other's sins." Whenever we're moved to forgive another person, to heal a wound, to call someone up and say, "Let's start again our friendship. I'm sorry." That's the work of the Spirit. And in the Eucharist, we take all of that, those experiences together, and crystallize them in what we do here. For the bread and wine that are blessed are to be nourishment and healing for us. They are words in which give us the courage as we hear Jesus say, "This is my body, this is my blood poured out for you," that we can be generous as well in stepping out of our individuality and to share our lives. And when we see the imposition of hands over the Eucharistic elements of bread and wine to change them into the body and blood of Christ, we're reminded that those same imposition of hands was on us when we were baptized or confirmed or when I was ordained. It is the power of the Spirit to come into our lives to change us, to make something new. So today, on this 50th day of Easter, this Pentecost, we're asked to open our eyes to see how the risen Lord is working in our midst and changing our lives. He's changing them in a way that allows us to use words that heal, allows our lives to be nourishment for one another and bring healing, and allowing ourselves not to give in to that temptation to isolate who we are, but see that our lives are richer when we live for one another. Let's keep that in mind as we hear in the Eucharist, right after the words of institution, "This is my body, this is my blood," the words of Jesus. Do all of this in memory of me.